When the Romans left Britain, there was a power vacuum that was filled by Germanic tribes. This is the Saxon period of British history, dating from about the middle of the 5th century to near the end of the 8th century, when Vikings from the Scandinavian lands began a period of invasion and settlement that lasted for nearly 2 centuries before they were subdued. If not for the efforts of Alfred the Great, a Saxon leader and first king of England, the Viking invasions and occupation may have lasted much longer. And it was his conquest of the Vikings that set the stage for his later contributions in unifying England and instilling social reforms that defined a people for centuries to come. Although there continued to be skirmishes, eventually the Vikings created settlements of their own, particularly around York in a region called the Danelaw, meaning Scandinavian England. Essentially, Alfred's strategy was to integrate the Vikings into the peoples of Britain, rather than trying to eradicate them. This practical sense of cooperation for a greater good seems to have been a theme in the life of Alfred, not only in his military campaigns, but in the social domains of law and politics, religion and education. It is the social achievements of Alfred on which we now focus as we consider the psychic input of Edgar Cayce. Cayce gave at least 30 readings for 26 individuals said to have lived during the lifetime of Alfred the Great, including a reading for Alfred himself. One of the most lauded achievements associated with the reign of Alfred was the establishment of a legal system based on trial by jury. Interestingly, the Cayce readings contain information on several individuals who are said to have been a part of the progress in legal proceedings during Alfred's reign. For example, a reading for a 4-year-old boy detailed a past life as a man named Chacham during the reign of Alfred the Great. This was at the time of the beginning of trial by jury. The reading for this lad noted that during that incarnation, Chacham was a good arguer and was among the first to argue a case before a jury. His reading observed that this trait was carried over into the 20th century, even in the early years, where this individual would be able to argue anything that was presented to him. His reading noted that this ability reflects a great mental capacity that should be directed in constructive ways by spiritual understanding. In the lifetime as Chacham, he failed a bit from a spiritual perspective, while gaining much from a strictly material standpoint. Incidentally, the reading for this boy also identified an incarnation as John Smith, the explorer who played an important part in the establishment of Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. So apparently the ability to state his case and convincingly influence others was a strong soul pattern for this individual. A reading for a 55-year-old man who wrote religious music described a past life as a legal advocate at the time of Alfred. In the name Chatham, this individual used his ability to influence others in support of King Alfred's legal innovations. The reading is explicit in crediting Alfred as the one who changed the nature of legal proceedings by introducing trial by jury, rather than simply justice by unilateral imperial action or one individual lording it over another. Trial by jury is fair and more just, with less opportunity for a powerful individual to be swayed by personal interests. Thus, Alfred sought unity among his people and felt that trial by jury would make for better relationships in the society of that time. Chatham was a spokesman and supporter of Alfred's legal reforms. In the 20th century, this individual was encouraged to use these innate abilities through writing and counseling others in every walk of life and field of service. Evidently, Chatham was a popular name in Alfred's kingdom, for it comes up again in a reading for a 37-year-old salesman of leather goods. A past life as a judge at the time of Alfred was described. Taking into consideration his 20th century profession as clothing salesman, his reading delves into the fashions of that medieval era by noting that Judge Chatham was among the first to wear a wig to distinguish himself from others. The reading pointed out that the tendency to be conscious of fashion and style carried over into his modern life and could be of benefit in a commercial sense. He was also encouraged not to be timid about expressing himself with regard to moral or penal law, for he had carried over an innate knowledge of such matters from his experience as judge at the time of Alfred. A reading for a 35-year-old businessman described a past life as Edgar Cayce at the time of Alfred. His reading also emphasized that it was Alfred who adopted trial by jury of one's own brethren, one's own equals or peers, so that the rights of the individual would be upheld. This reading also pointed out that Alfred encouraged the separation of church and state. Edgar Cayce spoke in support of Alfred on these issues, and the reading for this individual observed that this man had carried over the tendency to speak his mind on such issues in his current lifetime. A reading for a 24-year-old music student discussed a past life as Cayce when he was a counselor to Alfred. He gained and lost through the experience, using power selfishly. Thus he was dealing with some negative karma in his modern life, where he experienced fears pertaining to law, legal entanglements involving money or property, and those in power. Sounds like he may have run into some legal problems with King Alfred during that lifetime. A reading for a 29-year-old housewife identified a past life as Felice Shaughnessy during the reign of Alfred the Great. The reading sets the context of that time as a period of turmoils, as noted by historians. Yet there was great progress made in how people treat each other at every level, whether in the family, between social groups, or even between people of other lands, such as the Vikings. The reading for this individual noted that during the reign of Alfred, there were studies made toward political unification, a unity of purpose for all. Just as there were turmoils at the time of Alfred, there were turmoils within this woman in her modern life. As a lesson learned, she was encouraged to follow the example set by Alfred, to unify the experience as was accomplished in that past life. A reading for a 68-year-old housewife described a past life as Catherine during the reign of Alfred the Great. It was a time when social and political relationships were redefined, when the rights of the common peoples were considered as to whether they should be ruled by might or by permission, not by opportunity, but rather by choice. Catherine was active during this period of political change, and not always for the best. The reading observed that she gained and lost from the experience, losing and forcing the issue at times for her own agenda. She was told that her past life as Catherine would create opportunities for her to associate with those in political position and power. The challenge would be whether she used the opportunities selfishly, as she did at the time of Alfred, or for healing in service to others. A reading for a 63-year-old writer and lecturer described a past life as Garcia, who was closely associated with Alfred the Great. This individual was a strong advocate for the principles of democracy and freedom of activity and speech. In her modern life, she manifested many of the same qualities, such as being a good listener and being able to draw parallels between the practical experiences of others. This contributes to a greater unity as the spirit of truth in the lives of all, as it did at the time of Alfred the Great. One of the important outcomes of the Viking invasions was to unite the scattered groups that inhabited Britain during that era. A reading for a 56-year-old engineer and company executive described a past life as Scarface John. The reading noted how the varied groups occupying Britain joined together for self-protection from the Norsemen. Although Scarface was not necessarily interested in Alfred's political efforts to unify the state and nation, at a practical level he did come to understand the importance of cooperation for safety, in consideration of all the individuals and groups involved. Alfred the Great was a scholar who could read and transcribe manuscripts. This manifested in his keen interest in education for his subjects. A reading for a 43-year-old bookkeeper described a past life as a cleric during the reign of Alfred. With the name Clary, and in the court of the ruler, this individual assisted with the copying of records. She gained from the experience by sharing information on the conditions that existed, but lost at times by seeking personal gain from the knowledge that she scribed. The challenge in her modern incarnation was to make knowledge a practical application of love in her life. A reading for a 51-year-old high school teacher described a past life as Isabella, a scribe to Alfred the Great. Isabella was among those who aided Alfred in communicating the tenets of self-government and personal responsibility. In particular, she gained in soul development as a teacher of the young of that period by providing instruction on how to apply the principles of self-government. She carried over into her modern incarnation this very same pattern of law and order in every phase of life, in the home, at school, in the neighborhood where she lived. A reading given for a 20-year-old artist described a past life as a writer at the time of Alfred. In the name Alglany, this individual served in the upper echelon of the church. He gained through the experience in service to others, and especially defending the rights of the people under his care. In his later years, he may have allowed his own views to become too predominant, as he was dismissed from his position. As a result of that lifetime, his reading cautioned him against becoming too rigid-minded or set in his ways toward others to consider the other fellow's viewpoint, to give as much quarter in thought and deed as would be desired by himself in the same situation. A reading given for a 2-year-old girl described a past life at the time of Alfred, when there was being created a division of church and state. In the name Maud Johnson's, this individual was in the household of those close to the rulers of the church. Apparently there was some disagreements about the separation of church and state that led to suppression and resentment on the part of Maud Johnson's. So much so that in her next incarnation in colonial America, she continued with the same pattern of resistance and resentment in religious matters. Her parents in her 20th-century incarnation were told that when corrections were to be made, it would be preferable to quietly reason with the child rather than creating turmoil and resistance. Apparently, Alfred's attempts at the separation of church and state met with some pretty strong resistance on the part of some of his subjects, even echoing into 2 future incarnations in the case of Maud Johnson's. A reading for a 27-year-old lawyer described a past life as a monk in the cloister during the reign of Alfred. In the name Adel Ersekhan, this monk had been chosen for the study of religion as applied to man's development in practical ways. Interestingly, the studies of this monk may have also included chemistry and related fields of knowledge that carried over into the 20th century as a fascination tinged with fear. A reading for a 20-year-old college student described a past life as a monk named Olioth. This was during Alfred's reign that established laws pertaining to those elements governing the human race. Olioth was chosen to study music and chemistry. His music included setting the songs of David to melody. He loved the music but hated the chemistry. His reading used the term black arts to describe his chemical labors, which he detested. Perhaps he was made to create poisons or toxic substances. Or maybe he merely resented his work in chemistry because he was made to do it in a dictatorial manner rather than by choice. In his 20th century incarnation, he carried over from this medieval sojourn an innate love of mystery and old writing. A reading for a 19-year-old man described a past life in a monastery during the reign of Alfred. Apparently this individual was the superior of the monastery in the name Abbot Dexel. He was especially gifted in writing music, and particularly the pastoral music of that period that expressed the beauty and life of nature. Abbot Dexel did encounter some difficulties by way of disputation with those in authority. Thus, in addition to his love of medieval pastoral music, he also carried into his modern incarnation a tendency to question every authority, whether penal, moral, or spiritual. His reading encouraged him to consider the role of will in the study and application of such knowledge in his modern life. One of the most fascinating stories among the many past lives at the time of Alfred the Great comes from a series of readings given for Edgar Cayce's son, Edgar Cayce. As a 16-year-old Norse warrior who was part of an invasion force that came into what is now Scotland, he suffered an injury that carried over into his 20th century incarnation as marks that would sometimes appear on his left hand, below the forefinger and thumb. In the name Olaf Eriksson, he had a change of heart and converted to Christianity, taking vows and the coarse cloth of the cow as a monk. Curiously, as a recluse in a monkery, he studied chemistry, as we noted in some of the other cases that we have surveyed. He was provided plenty of time for mental reflection upon the meaning of his journey as it relates to the purpose of life. In his modern life, he was encouraged to utilize that tendency to seek knowledge, to write and to lecture based upon the reasoning of his mind, much as he had done in that past life as a Norse monk in Britain. The story of Olaf Eriksson highlights another theme that runs throughout the history of Alfred the Great. Alfred was a unifier, seeking integration not only among his own people, but even with those Viking invaders who sought to conquer and dominate his land and people. In the case of Olaf Eriksson, religion and education furthered Alfred's political agenda by bringing people together, even those who had been enemies. The readings for this case indicate that Olaf Eriksson lived to be 59 years old, and his sojourn carried over into the reign of Alfred's heirs. A reading for a 59-year-old housewife provided details about a past life as a woman named Lillian, who was among the household of Alfred. Her reading described the changes in relationships that were occurring during Alfred's reign, even within his own household. Lillian appears to have been in charge of running the household and making decisions pertaining to various stations of life, whether matters of custom and state, power and position, or of the laboring people. The change in relationships between the servants and those being served reflected the broader emphasis within society of justice among many rather than the voice or dictates of one individual. Lillian was instrumental in establishing and directing the moral, mental, and spiritual life within the household of Alfred, an ability she carried over into her 20th century experience. A reading for a 24-year-old housewife described a past life as a member of Alfred's household named Sophia Kerr. Sophia was a student of the law as it applied to church and state and to individual rights. She was influential in promoting equal rights among individuals and accomplished much good for others, although stumbling herself in the application of these lofty tenets. In her 20th century incarnation, she carried over a keen interest and fascination for the relations of individuals, groups, and nations, and especially for the traditional laws of England, which her reading encouraged her to study. A reading for a 50-year-old milliner described a past life for a woman named Lady Gondolivia, who was of the household of Alfred. She gained through the experience because she was able to set aside her own status and position, being of service to others in helping them to understand truth. By identifying her social status in relation to Alfred, her reading contains the curious phrase, "that good and bad ruler." Apparently, Alfred the Great had a dark side, as well as the widely credited benevolence ascribed by historians. A reading given on April 24, 1924, for a retired farmer described a past life as King Alfred. The man was Edgar Cayce's father, Leslie B. Casey. The date of the reading is significant, as it is one of the early horoscope readings given by Edgar Cayce when he was living in Dayton, Ohio. The early life readings tended to be rather brief, with scant information on past lives, as we shall see. Of particular note, the suggestion for this reading requested an answer to the question of whether the individual was fitted to be an organizer. A comment included with the reading noted that he was trying to perfect an organization to preserve the supremacy of the white race. Keep in mind that he lived in Kentucky at the time. The astrological influences cited in the reading observed that there was a lack of the proper use of will, resulting in selfishness and desires or appetites, bringing troubles in the experience. Another comment added to the reading noted that the man had been a drunkard for many years during the first half of his life, and that his wife and children had suffered for it. The reading mentioned that there had been many adverse physical influences to his body, which was confirmed by his children, who stated that he had broken nearly every bone in his body at one time or other. After a lengthy discussion of the astrological influences for this soul entity, the reincarnation section only included 3 past lives, with a single sentence for each, the most recent being that of Alfred, called the Great. That is an interesting and somewhat ambiguous way of identifying that important historical figure. Was it an insinuation that perhaps Alfred was not really all that great? Certainly we have dwelt at length on the greatness of Alfred as a warrior, educator, religious leader, legal innovator, and politician. And yet one can reasonably wonder about Alfred's shortcomings. Did Alfred have a dark side? After all, much of what history tells us about Alfred comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the History of the Britons, works that Alfred himself commissioned. Of course he came out looking pretty good. Apparently St. Neot, a kinsman and religious counselor to Alfred, often rebuked him severely for his sinful living, pride and power, tyranny and oppression, rather than moderation and justice. This was perhaps during Alfred's early years as ruler, and yet does hint a bit at that phrase from the readings, that good and bad ruler. Perhaps by noting that Alfred was called the Great, the reading for this man was simply attempting to keep him from getting the big head about a famous past life. The single sentence on that past life as Alfred did emphasize the legal aspect of that incarnation, while predicting that in the next earthly life he would be a lawyer. That is certainly consistent with historical accounts and the reincarnational cases that we have reviewed previously in this section. The other 2 past lives described in this reading mentioned an incarnation in France, when it was known as Gaul, during the time of Hannibal in the 2nd and 3rd century BC. He lost his life in the hold of a trade ship. His 20th century desire for the supremacy of the white race was said to have originated from that incarnation. The earliest incarnation cited in the reading was in early Atlantis, when humans were struggling to subdue animals, both the beasts of the earth and the beasts within the individuals of that mythic place and time. Soul development is complex and not necessarily linear in what we might regard as an upward progression, with each lifetime exhibiting a higher consciousness. In fact, 614 life readings are indexed with the term soul retrogression, indicating that the soul's journey can have its ups and downs. Even the life readings for Edgar Cayce noted some bumps along the way, most notably in his recent past life as a scoundrel named Bainbridge. So we shouldn't be too hard on his father, assuming he really had been a notable British king. And perhaps even Alfred, that good and bad ruler called Great, stumbled at times in that remarkable incarnation during the beginnings of Britain. The numerous readings for those associated with Alfred, either directly or through his initiatives as ruler, definitely indicate numerous positive contributions by the man who, despite his struggles and shortcomings, gained in that experience as a soul, enriching the collective human experience of those in his kingdom and we who have followed in the centuries that have passed.